I'm David Liu from Melbourne, Australia, joining you from Philadelphia at ACR Conversions 2022. My name is not Jack Cush, but tonight I will be sharing this daily recap that we've got today on the last day of the first real meeting back in person, some virtual as well. And so I've got an all-star panel here of our Room Now reporters. Many years of experience here on this panel to talk through some of the exciting things that happened today. So I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. Catherine, may I start with you?
Sure. Thanks, David, for having me on. So Catherine Dow, I'm here in Dallas. I was Jack Cush's old partner. In fact, I'm in his old office, and you can actually see these books right there from the 1970s.
Wow.
I have now assumed his office.
Office we're also used to seeing on the Week in Review videos, but now you're in the chair. All right, Julian, introduce yourself.
Thanks, David, and thanks to David and Jack and the team for having me. I'm Julian Segan. I'm from Melbourne, Australia, and this is my first time ever attending the ACR in person in Philly.
Wonderful. Richard Conway.
Hi everyone, I'm Richard Conway from Dublin, Ireland, and currently in Dublin, Ireland, doing the ACR virtually with all the joy that entails.
Olga.
Hi, I'm Olga Petrina from Scarsdale Medical Group, practicing in New York metro area, and I'm reporting from New York virtually as well.
Wonderful. And Aurelie.
Hi everyone, I am Aurélie Nage from Glasgow, Scotland, and I'm delighted to be here in Philadelphia and to be here tonight with you for that panel.
Wonderful. All right. So let's start talking about some of the highlights from today. Catherine, tell us a little bit about what's caught your attention out on the conference floor today, virtual conference floor.
Absolutely. So the glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis prevention guidelines were actually presented. It's a little bit controversial because there's not a lot of data, as you can imagine, but all of us, we use corticosteroids for pretty much most of our rheumatic disease conditions that have an inflammatory component, from polymyalgia rheumatica to lupus to rheumatoid arthritis, name it. We are very liberal with steroids. But how do we prevent fractures, right? So the guidelines are designed to talk about, what to do, particularly in certain circumstances. Even at 2.5 milligrams a day, that can increase your risk for fracture, both vertebral as well as the hip fracture. It's a no-brainer. If it's an older person, higher risk for fracturing, sure, start them on therapy, bisphosphonates, denosumab, Forteo, or teriparatide, right? But what do you do in kids? What do you do in somebody who wants to get pregnant? I mean, those are the issues that the guidelines are trying to address. And the other thing that I didn't realize, which some of your viewers may, is that if a patient is high risk and is on cumulative dose of steroids, more than 5 grams in a year, okay, that's more 5 grams in a year, high risk, or if they've been on more than 10 milligrams a day for months on end and are at actually high risk, when you calculate their FRAX score, you have to multiply hip fracture risk by 1.2 and vertebral fracture or major osteoporosis fracture risk by 1.12. So you have to multiply up in order to see whether or not they meet threshold for fracture. So that's one thing from the guidelines. The second thing from the guidelines is that even though a patient has a bone density score of negative 2.5, you still need to calculate the FRAX. I mean, I never did that. Do you? I was like, they have osteoporosis. Why would I calculate the FRAX? Okay, there's a rationale behind this. It's so that you know what the probability in the next 10 years is that they will fracture, right? And then the third part of the guidelines says that, so in younger patients, now these are like patients who are kids 18 or younger, they actually said if they're high risk for fracture or had a fracture, go ahead and treat them with a bisphosphonate. And that blew my mind. I was like, what's the data, right? Or in somebody who's like in their 20s, high risk, and they want to get pregnant in 5 years. Do we hold the bisphosphonate? What do we do? So the committee says that, the best treatment would probably be risedronate because it has a short half-life. I mean, I don't know what you all think about these guidelines. Have you been incorporating any of these beforehand? You know, do you have concerns?
Well, let me ask the group. Let's just put hands up as a show of, let's be honest here. So who thinks that they're perfect at treating steroid-induced osteoporosis? Julian does. Someone
Definitely not.
That, I think. Who thinks that they would put more than 50% of their eligible patients that the guidelines would suggest should be on some sort of pharmacotherapy, puts 50%, that you put greater than 50% of those patients on pharmacotherapy in your everyday clinical practice?
I'm nervous.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be nervous because I don't know and I haven't seen the data. I want to know the data because how long are we going to treat these patients for? They're so young. I mean, yes, they're at higher risk, but they're so young.
Absolutely. And well, I think we've got better and better data. I mean, we've seen data at this meeting looking at the impact of 2.5 milligrams a day on bone, on bone density. And we know that the impact that we've seen previously on architecture, this is a really interesting space that we're trying to work our way through. And we're appreciating the increasing long-term impact of, well, the numbers of patients that in reality is still on steroids when we're really honest with ourselves. We all think we don't do it, but we clearly do. Anyone got any thoughts on these steroid-induced osteoporosis guidelines? Does it surprise anyone else?
I think it almost reinforces some of what we've been doing. A lot of the time, like most of my patients who are on long-term steroids are older. They have PMR, GCA, ANCA vasculitis, and they all tend to be older. And I've always tended to leave them on to treat them and to leave them on an anti-resorptive until they finish their steroids, and then reassess their fracture risk after that. And in some ways, I felt a little bit uncomfortable about doing that. Maybe I shouldn't be leaving them on so long, but I think it's great. It's always nice when the guidelines come out and they say that you've been doing the right thing all along. And I think the really challenging patients are those younger ones. But thankfully, for whatever reason, I don't seem to have too many of those younger patients who are left on long-term steroids.
I think the young females as well, and that's what a lot of us are concerned about, especially with bisphosphonates. We know they get incorporated into bones. They can last for years, if not longer. And we really don't know what effect they have on fetus development. And so I think that that's a big unanswered question. I don't know how to answer that question with research, but clearly it's an area of uncomfortableness for us.
Well, there's plenty to reflect on from those guidelines. I think it's really nice to get that kind of guidance from the college on all of that. Well, let's talk.
One more thing, David. So I would say that the experts did say, when in doubt, consult a mineral metabolism expert. So I'll leave it with that.
Is that us? I don't know. Is that us?
That's endocrinology, mineral metabolism, a whole different department. I don't know about what you have down under, but like for us, we do have a whole department who treat, plain old osteoporosis and mineral metabolism issues like hypophosphatasia and such.
Yeah, we do as well, like chronic kidney disease associated mineral bone disease as well. So we definitely ask them for help.
That is the way the world is going. So, Julian, tell us a little bit about what's caught your attention today. I think you've seen some interesting things in the plenaries.
Yeah, thanks, David. So the third plenary was today, and one thing that I thought was really cool, and I'd like to hear other people's opinions on it. There's Dr. Max Koenig from Johns Hopkins presented something called catcher therapy. So I think everyone's seen that CAR T therapy has been really exciting at this meeting. The data in lupus patients that Georg Schett presented is really interesting. But clearly that wasn't good enough for Dr. Koenig, who said that CAR T therapy looks like it just indiscriminately kills B cells. And we know that it does have potential issues, including the cytokine release syndrome, as well as potential prolonged immunosuppression. So what him and his lab have done is developed some specialized CAR T cells which target certain cell lines within B cells. So what they did was they used gene editing technology, CRISPR-Cas9, and they got some cell markers from beta-2 glycoprotein 1 for people from a patient that has antiphospholipid syndrome. And what they did was they engineered these CAR T cells to selectively attack these cells, and then they had some dummy cells, and they showed that it attacked and destroyed the beta-2 glycoprotein 1 cells and left the other cells alone. So I think that brings us closer towards truly targeted treatments in our diseases. We're falling behind hematology and oncology in this regards, and really is exciting to be able to potentially have targeted therapies with less side effects.
Well, we only had CAR T for a minute before we started to go to this catcher, this after T cell receptors. So do you think that this is all still in Max Koenig's lab, right? This is still, we haven't let this loose on patients, but it's awfully enticing, this really targeted therapy, precision strikes. So is it just going to be antiphospholipid syndrome? Do you think this is going to work? And in antiphospholipid syndrome, in clinical antiphospholipid syndrome, and then where else are we going to take this? What's the future?
So the caveat is I'm no expert in antiphospholipid syndrome. The abstract does say that that the beta-2 glycoprotein 1 antibodies are pathogenic in antiphospholipid syndrome. So I suspect if it works, it will work at least partially in this condition. But I think clearly this has applicability way beyond antiphospholipid syndrome, particularly where you can find pathogenic autoantibodies, which are littered all across our diseases and outside of rheumatology as well.
Big calls here. It's going to be interesting. So, okay, let's do a poll of the crowd here again. Who thinks that this is going to be something that we'll see having a clinical impact in severe antiphospholipid syndrome, say CAPS? Any takers?
I know it's going to make a big difference with lupus because of the abstracts that were presented at EULAR. I mean, for the first time, patients are considered cured. And so it's very interesting to see whether or not this kind of therapy lends itself to other autoimmune diseases. Now, obviously, you just basically have to ablate the whole bone marrow. And so that puts the patient at higher risk for infection. They could have the reconstitution immune inflammatory response, kind of like what Julian was saying. And so it remains to be seen how it's going to work. And I don't know if I would invest in stocks yet, but it's something to keep an eye out for.
RT is certainly pretty expensive per patient, so the money's got to be going somewhere. And this, I'm guessing, is not going to be cheap either. Very interesting. All right, Julian, I think you just did briefly want to tell us a little bit about denosumab as well. I think there's been a lot of tongues waving at this abstract, getting us all excited.
Yeah, well, I think it gets us excited and unexcited in equal measure. So this is an abstract in the late breaking session today, L05, looking at denosumab on structural modification in erosive hand osteoarthritis. So just the top line summary is that this was 12 weekly rather than 6 monthly denosumab. This actually significantly reduced structural progression over the 24-week period, as well as the 12-week period, as well as the 96-week period. But really what was disappointing is that it made almost no difference in terms of pain, and it made almost no difference in terms of function. And so these are really important, just because we improve structure, that's only really a small part of this. And as one of my supervisors used to say, this is the so what factor. So we really need something that's going to improve our patients rather than just improve the x-rays.
Well, I mean, we don't have a whole lot that stops the structural damage in erosive OA. You're a hard man, Julian. Let me ask Richard and Olga and Aurelie, do you think that this is too good to believe? Are these results too dramatic in that short period, or 24-week period of time? Or do you think that this is real with bone?
I think it's believable that it's working that quickly. I find it hard to understand how it's not helping pain and function if it's helping structure, and then where is the pain coming from? And that's an interesting question. Why, if you're reversing or preventing structural damage, are these patients still having the same amount of pain? I'm also a bit uncomfortable with 12-weekly denosumab for a long-term condition that is scary. We know that 12-weekly is higher risk of osteonecrosis, atypical fractures compared to the 6-monthly.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I'm obliged at this point to repeat the Kush recipe for erosive OA, hand erosive OA, which is a pred of 2.5, some taping, bit of acetaminophen, and general prayers, I think, right? That pulls through most of the time. That's what it's got to beat right now. So,
but if you remember, like, you know, DMAB was studied originally for rheumatoid arthritis, and it never made approval for RA, even though it's, you know, halted rank ligands activity. And the reason why it never got approved for RA is because it didn't help with pain or swelling. I mean, it helped to prevent the erosions, but you still got pain and swelling. And boy, it's going to be hard to convince a patient to take something that won't help their pain and swelling, because that's what most of my patients complain of with EOA. It's like the most hardest diagnosis to treat, and it's frustrating.
So what are we going to have to do? Is this going to be combo therapy? Is it going to be a bit of pred plus denosumab? Going to give methotrexate plus denosumab? What are we doing?
I'm sending them to Nancy Lane.
All right, let's keep on moving. Richard, tell me what you've got on the agenda today. A bit of ILD, perhaps?
Yeah, a bit of ILD, one of my favorite things. So I've abstract 2251 from Matthew Baker from Stanford. And RA-ILD, as we all know, it's relatively common, 8% of RA patients. And it's a bad thing. Once you get RA-ILD, your median survival is 3 years. And despite that, we have no good idea how to treat it. We have no randomized controlled trials in RA-ILD, and no comparative trials really of any sort. So what they did in this study is they used the Optum database, and they had 29,000 RA patients without ILD who were treated with biologic or TS DMARDs. And they were particularly looking at tofacitinib and how that might affect incident ILD. So the first thing they did was they calculated crude incident rates for the various drugs. So per 1,000 patient years, they came out with values of 3.4 for adalimumab, with 6 for rituximab, with 5 for tocilizumab, 4.4 for abatacept, and 1.4 for tofacitinib. And then they went on and they did multiple corrections, adjustments for this, and came out with an adjusted hazard ratio of 0.31 for tofacitinib compared to adalimumab for the development of incident RA-ILD. And they weren't satisfied with this, so they went on and did another different analysis using a prevalent new user cohort design with propensity score matching. And when they did this, they came out with a very similar result. So they found an adjusted hazard ratio of 0.33 for tofacitinib compared to adalimumab. So that's a really dramatic finding, a 67% decrease in incident RA-ILD with tofacitinib. Of course, there are a lot of limitations to this. This is a retrospective study. It was done in a large database, so we don't have very detailed information on these patients, but it's encouraging. We desperately need treatments that work in this condition and evidence that they work. So I'm optimistic for the future based on this.
So Richard, can I ask you a quick question? So based on that study, did they have any increased VTEs or cardiovascular event? Because, you know, these patients with ILD, they're at much higher risk for cardiopulmonary issues.
Well, that's a very, very good point, because RA-ILD is more common in elderly patients and patients who have other comorbidities. So they may not be the ones you want to give a JAK to. They didn't look at it, or they didn't tell us about it. But it would potentially be a concern. Having said that, if you're having this dramatic improvement in RA-ILD, which is a very, very bad thing, it might overcome those relatively small increases that we know happen in cardiovascular and VTE.
Has anyone here actually used tofacitinib in RA-ILD? Or has anyone had much experience treating it?
I use it for RA, and if they happen to have ILD, I don't necessarily have noticed whether or not there's been trends to improvement in their PFTs. But specifically for RA-ILD, I have not. I don't know if Olga or Richard or David has ever used it specifically for that indication.
I never had an opportunity to start JAK inhibitor for ILD RA specifically. But as you just mentioned, like if they happen to be on it for RA, we just let the pulmonology, add their treatment options and then see how they do, but really didn't get to observe treatment response for long enough. Yeah.
So Richard, do you believe these data? And I mean, if you do, then what's going on here? Why is there a difference between the therapies? Because I think that's what we were all asking, and that's the question we're all trying to tease out.
Yeah, I don't know if I believe them. I can very conceivably believe that tofacitinib might be better for ILD than a TNF inhibitor. What confuses me most is the fact that rituximab and abatacept and tocilizumab look even worse than the TNF inhibitor, potentially, which doesn't make sense to me. So I don't trust it fully, but I think it gives a rationale to go on and do more detailed studies in this.
Interesting. So do you think it's residual confounding that hasn't been washed out yet, or what's going on there? Is it because it doesn't, I mean, those are the drugs that we would usually think about going to, aren't they? Thinking about Ritux and abatacept.
Absolutely. I suppose they are looking at incident or ILD, and we would go to those drugs to treat ILD, which is where the evidence is. So there may be a differential there, that they're not preventing it, but that they potentially are good in the treatment of it. And we know, the other thing we know is, and we shouldn't forget, the best evidence we have for any drug to prevent RA-ILD is for methotrexate.
Yeah, that's right. We need to keep on yelling that from the rooftops, don't we? All right, Olga, what have you seen that's interesting today?
Yes, so I really like the abstract 1669, which talk about the safety and effectiveness of DMARDs in treatment of checkpoint inhibitor arthritis, presented by Dr. Bass from HSS. I think it's a great and a very important topic because we see more and more patients with cancer who are treated with checkpoint inhibitors, and more of them end up in our clinic with the side effects or consequences of their treatment. So in this study, they took patients who had symptoms of a checkpoint inhibitor arthritis, and on average, the time from the initiation of checkpoint inhibitor treatment to the onset of arthritis was close to 4 or 5 months for those patients. And then interestingly, it took another 5 to 6 months for patients to be started on treatment on average based on the study. So by that time, it seems they had quite active arthritis with high CDAI scores. And then they looked at the response to treatment as well as time to progression of underlying malignancy. So that was like the main safety concern in the study. And they saw that patients were given either TNF inhibitor or IL-6. Actually, most of them were on either IL-6 inhibitor alone or methotrexate alone. And of course, there is TNF methotrexate combos and IL-6 methotrexate combinations. So here they saw that when patients were given methotrexate monotherapy, it took them longer to respond to treatment. Patients who received combination of either TNF or IL-6 with methotrexate responded to treatment the fastest, and their symptoms were relieved the fastest. But at the same time, they had the shortest time to cancer progression, which is a big concern. So the question is, like, where is that perfect balance where we treat sufficiently enough to relieve their symptoms, but do not harm the underlying condition, do not make it progress faster or more severely? My question would be, like, when I looked at the data and how they presented the figures in the study, they put TNF mono, IL-6 mono along with the combination patients together. So I would be curious to know if you give, let's say, IL-6 inhibitor or TNF inhibitor alone, would they have like longer time to progression, or would their response to treatment be good enough to consider it as a good alternative? So definitely it triggers a lot of questions and a lot of discussions. And I think more clinical trials will be needed to study this topic, but I think it's a very interesting presentation.
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm biased because it's a whole lot of my IRA friends from big US centers who did this excellent work, but it's clearly a bit of a complicated relationship that TNF has in terms of cancer in this context, some for, some against, and trying to tease apart. Dr. Bass, of course, is a world expert as far as that's concerned. Do you think that if you were a patient with a rheumatic immune-related adverse event from checkpoint inhibitor immunotherapy, and you had pretty bad symptoms up front, but a potentially deadly cancer, do you think you'd go to methotrexate first, or to infliximab, or to tocilizumab? What do you reckon, Olga? What would you do for yourself?
I think it's a very difficult question, and I don't honestly know what I would do. I think methotrexate to me sounds like a good medium. Look, where you may take longer to work, you may not have as good pain relief, but it is indeed safer in terms of cancer safety. So that sounds like a good measure. But again, it depends on the severity. Like when the person suffers from severe arthritis and they're debilitated, how much pain and suffering can they take?
I'm glad you haven't figured it out, because I don't think I have either. Anyone else in the group got any advances on that?
There's been previous studies that show that patients who have these IC-related, immune-related adverse events actually do have better prognosis, right? So their immune system is revved up, they kill the cancer, and this is just one study. There's been other studies that shows that IL-6 inhibitors might augment ICI treatments. And so if it were me, and if money was no object and my insurance would approve everything, I probably would go with tocilizumab, to be honest with you, and minimize the steroids. It's about the steroids too, because high amounts of steroids is going to render the ICI treatment ineffective.
That's a very
I've even heard of some protocols that they're actually giving immunosuppressants like interleukin-6 up front with the immunotherapy. So clearly the oncologists are not quite as worried about it as we are.
Well, I think it's a complicated story, but we did see data today from Noha Abdel-Wahab's team at MD Anderson looking at tocilizumab in combination with nivolumab and ipilimumab prospectively in that context, and the data looked pretty good. But there's something to be said for immune homeostasis, isn't there, really? Trying to hit that to get to that middle bit where you're not pushing too far and back the other way. In fact, that's a perfect time to segue to orally, because you're looking at the other side of the coin, aren't you?
It is indeed.
What's going on there?
And actually, it's not so often that we get a new mechanism of action in RA. And who else than Paul Emery to present it today in the late breaking abstract session? So, I mean, yeah, quite exciting, isn't it? We obviously know about immunotherapy, checkpoint inhibitors, PD-1, but then the question is, what if instead of inhibiting it, we actually activate it and try to restore immune homeostasis in RA? And some people thought about that, and they put together this elegant phase 2A placebo-controlled RCT, where they look at peresolimab, it's the name of that PD-1 agonist, in a fairly small sample. It was 100 patients, and they were randomized 2-1-1. So they had 2 doses of peresolimab, 700 milligrams for 50 patients, 300 milligrams for 25 roughly, and then placebo for 25. And so they gave the treatment to patients. So basically it's an infusion. And they gave the treatment to patients for 12 weeks. And the primary outcome was the DAS-CRP and the change in DAS-CRP from baseline. And they also looked at CDAI, and they were able to show that in both those, basically there is an improvement, significant improvement of these parameters in the treated patients. They also showed that for those patients who continued up to week 24, because they were getting benefit from it, the CDAI improvement was actually sustained. So that's quite exciting. And then on top of that, there's a couple of things that they highlighted that I think, worth discuss here with you guys, because so the first thing was, if you look into DAS28 components, what was the most improved was actually swollen joint count, tender joint count, patient global, and CRP was not necessarily modified. I mean, it was quite heterogeneous. So that's quite interesting. The second thing that was even more interesting, and it was a trend and it was not necessarily significant, but it seemed that, patients that had previous exposure to biologic or targeted synthetic DMARDs were actually responding better than those who were bio-naive. I mean, how often do we see a drug that actually, does better in inadequate responders to biologic? It's a trend. So I guess it would have to be confirmed, in further studies. But that kind of highlights the concept as well, that maybe patients that are inadequate responders to biologic, they have a more disrupted immunity somehow, and maybe that helps mostly these patients. I don't know. It's early. It's too early to say, but that's quite interesting. And I'm really looking forward to see, phase 2B, phase 3 studies.
Yeah, well, I mean, we certainly could do with more mechanisms of action for those refractory patients. That's exciting. And that'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. Now, of course, the big question in that is what about the cancer question, given that PD-1 inhibition is something that we use against a number of malignancies, as we just talked about. So what about the flip side? Are you worried, Aurelie?
I mean, it's a 24-week study. So if you were to observe any cancer event, you probably wouldn't in such a short period of time, right? In terms of side effects, adverse events, they were pretty much comparable between groups. There was no specific signal. There was no dose effect either. But when it comes to cancer, I think it's really hard to say. This being said, it's been proven in the past, and we have like a lot of examples that the reversing effects doesn't necessarily apply in many diseases. So I think we will have to see, but I wouldn't be worried just now about it.
Because we're not particularly worried about abatacept now, although we were when it first came to market, worried a bit about lung cancer. And there's incident cancers, and we know our patients get cancer anyway. So teasing that out is going to take a lot to reassure ourselves, I think. Before we finish up, and I realize we've gone over time, but, I'll take the chair's prerogative and let's just keep on running for a little bit. I want to go around the group and ask you, this is the last day of a conference with a new format. Either one thing that you really liked about this or one thing that you really hope will change. Let's start at the top of the screen. Catherine, tell us what you really liked or what you'd want to really change from this format.
I love the fact that they are upping their game and choosing keynote speakers, because Dr. Varghese, oh my God. I mean, I'm talking about fangirl here. I've been reading all his books. I'm, such a big fan of his work, and for them to bring him in and then just, the way he talks, the way he unravels a story. I mean, you saw it yourself at the keynote speech. It's been amazing. So thank you, ACR, for bringing great speakers to the conference.
I've heard a lot of people saying that the last couple of days. Julian, tell me, what did you, this is your first ACR, isn't it? So
yeah, so my perspective is different for everyone, because this is clearly the biggest meeting I've ever been to, and much bigger than what we have at home and more locally. So, for me, it was an 11 out of 10, just because it's great to meet people, great to have such high quality data and sessions and education. So for me, I wouldn't have changed anything.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Richard, this is not your first meeting. Tell us a little bit about it.
Definitely not. I'm going to do a like and change, which are the same thing, which are the posters. I really like having a virtual poster, having a presentation of it recorded that the virtual attendees can see, but I really dislike there not being a poster hall and the presenters not having the opportunity to present and discuss their posters face to face with experts in the field.
Yeah, I mean, that's the physical poster hall floor used to be that hub of activity where you'd get all of your feedback from different people around the world, and you'd see friends, make new friends. So hearing a lot about that as well. Olga, what about you?
Well, I did like the choice of speakers. I think great speakers this year, so that's definitely a plus. The ability to go back and listen to presentation is amazing. What I did not like is the functionality of the app. I think it could be a little better. Even let's say if you wanted to ask a question like online, you had to type it in advance because there was a delay between when you type in and they actually receive it. So yeah, I think if we could improve the technology behind it, that'd be amazing. But all in all, it seems to be working great, having this opportunity to attend it virtually.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that's a big advantage of the online bit, that gives that equity in terms of getting people along, doesn't it? Aurelie, what do you think?
Yes, just before I answer that, I just realized I must be tired. I said it was an infusion, but the peresolimab is a subcut. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that. Anyway, yeah, I quite enjoy coming back and being able to catch up with a lot of people I hadn't seen in a while. Face-to-face conference is always great for that. I was a bit surprised to see that some of the rooms and some of the men's sessions were not very well attended face to face. I was a bit surprised about that. I'm not so sure why it is, but and the other thing was finding directions in a conference center was a bit difficult. You had to walk almost a mile sometimes to get from one room to another. But aside from that, I really enjoyed it.
Well, if it was a smaller conference venue, I think we'd all be disappointed, right? We want the big conference centers, don't we? And indeed, San Diego next year, it's going to be a big one. So I think we're all looking forward to it. So now's my opportunity to thank everyone that's joined us today, and to thank Catherine, Julian, Richard, Olga, and Aurelie for giving their thoughts today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.